Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I am Amy Kuth, a patient educator with the Stephen and Barbara Slaggie Family Cancer Education Center at Mayo Clinic, and I will be moderating this session. The title of today's webinar is Wait, That's an Option. This session is being recorded. If you prefer not to be recorded, please feel free to leave the live session, and once available, the video recording will be posted in the video library on our Mayo Clinic or on our cancer education blog on Mayo Clinic Connect. Mayo Clinic Connect is an online community where people can share experiences, find support, and exchange information with others. We encourage you to follow our cancer education blog on Mayo Clinic Connect to learn about our other offerings and to access additional education, support, and cancer-related resources. We will put a link to our cancer education blog in the chat for you to be able to click on at the end of our session. We will take questions at the end of the session today. If you have questions related to this webinar topic, please type them into the Q&A on the main toolbar on your Zoom screen. I'm honored to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Wendy Allen Rhoades is here today to discuss cancer clinical trials as part of today's treatment choices for the adolescent and young adult population. The goal today is to help patients better understand what clinical trials are and how they may be an option during cancer care. Dr. Allen Rhoades, I will now hand it over to you for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Amy. Hello, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Wendy Allen Rhoades, and I am really pleased to be starting off our AYA Awareness Month with this talk today, and hope that you find the information helpful. So I thought that I would just tell a little bit about who I am beyond being just a physician. I am a pediatric and AYA oncologist, but I also consider myself an advocate. I am a researcher. I am a self-proclaimed lover of bad music. I'm a mom to two beautiful children. And my oldest, who is preteen, tells me that social media is cringy for people of my age. So I will claim that title also. And my initials, if you think back to the first slide, are actually WAR. So many people call me WAR for short, which is arguably the most cool thing about me. I do have a social media presence, and I do like to talk about AYA and pediatric cancer on social media. So why are we talking about clinical trials today? Well, clinical trials help improve cancer care. And it's possible that you may be offered one as an option at some point in your cancer care journey. And this is really about helping you make informed choices when these things come up, or being able to bring them up as a question to your care team. I'm sorry, a little jumpy on my slides. So what exactly is a clinical trial and what is clinical research? It's a research study that involves people or patients, and often it tests new treatments or new ways to use current treatments, but it can also test new devices or new ways to diagnose certain conditions. Clinical trials are carefully planned and monitored, and there's always safety assessments that are built into the trials, which are a requirement to make sure that our trials are safe to start and to proceed. Clinical trials matter because current treatments that we offer today as oncologists came from trials in prior times that showed benefits for our patients. This is how we develop standard of care, or what is sort of our gold standard of how to treat patients. It also helps doctors learn what works best, and it advances science. It improves outcomes for future patients, and there's often a benefit to the patient that enrolls onto the clinical trial. I think one thing that I want people to take away from this webinar is learning about different myths and facts about clinical trials. Many people will say, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I don't want my child to be a guinea pig. I don't want you to test things, and I don't want to receive placebo. So kind of going into that first, I'm just a guinea pig and you're going to test things on me. Yes, this is how we test medications and devices and diagnostics in patients, but we are set up with stringent safety regulations in place to avoid harm to patients and futility. And safety is something that we look at on an ongoing basis. So if there is something that is happening in the trial that we deem not safe, or that an external board deems not safe, then that will be relayed to the study team, and that trial will then be paused and people will be made aware of that. In cancer care, there is very few trials that are placebo, which means that you receive sham treatment, or sometimes people call it like a sugar pill. In cancer treatment, you will receive at least standard of care for cancer-directed treatment, and sometimes standard of care may be observation or something like that, but most of the time it's not. And so it's not that you will receive no treatment, you will always receive at least standard of care. And I think the number one myth that people think about clinical trials is this is the last resort for me, and it's only for people who have no other options left. But the fact is that trials are used at many stages of diagnosis and treatment, from newly diagnosed patients who have many options to people who have been through several lines of chemotherapy, surgery, or radiation who may have limited options. So just because a clinical trial may be offered to you by the clinical team does not mean that there is no hope or there is no trial or there is no treatment options left for you. There are a lot of clinical trial types. One that I've sort of been alluding to in the previous discussion is treatment trials, and that looks at what can we do to treat that cancer better or differently. But we also have trials that look at prevention, and this may be patients who are at risk for developing a certain condition related to their cancer, or they may be at risk for developing cancer based on their genetics, and we're trying to prevent that from happening. We also look at quality of life. So how are people doing during their cancer therapy? And how can we improve quality of life by delivering care differently or in a different fashion to make things better and not so onerous on the patient? And then we also have trials that look at screening and diagnostics. So how can we better detect side effects? How can we better detect cancer? And how can we better look at different imaging modalities to better understand what is happening with the patient? So sometimes it's treatment, but not always. I think this is probably the most important slide of this whole webinar is what are the phases of clinical trials? And this is what I talk to with my patients the most in the clinic. So all the way on the left-hand side of the slide is preclinical or phase 0. And this is lab-based research to tell if a treatment we think is going to be useful or safe. And this is done in the laboratory without human involvement. So this is looking at cancer cells in a dish and maybe looking at cancer in animals, but we're not actually touching patients yet. Then we move on to phase 1. And 1, 2, 3 are sort of where we live in the cancer spectrum. So I'm actually going to skip all the way to phase 3 because I think it's easier to work backwards. So phase 3 is what we call safety and efficacy. So if somebody comes in and they're newly diagnosed with cancer X, and we say that this is our standard of care treatment, you're going to receive drug Y, we may have a trial that says, if we add drug Z to it, does that help? And that is a newly diagnosed trial comparing two treatments, what we know is standard of care, and can we make that better? Those studies come after all of the other phases, but those are the ones that a lot of people are enrolled on. These are large trials. They may include hundreds to thousands of participants at one site or across the country. And it's really saying, is this treatment better than what we already have? Then if you go all the way back to phase 1, that's really the first in human or the first in combination. So this is looking at safety, and this is where everything starts. This is where people get that myth that this is my last resort or this is no other options exist. Sometimes people who are eligible for phase 1 have gone through multiple lines of chemotherapy, surgery, or radiation, and we're trying to see if something else may work, but really we have to prove the safety and the feasibility first. These are very, very small trials, maybe 10 to 80 participants, and we're really just seeing what does that medication or that treatment do in the human body, and can we assess its safety, and can we figure out what the dose is for the next phase of study, which is that phase 2. So the phase 2 is a little bit bigger. It's a couple hundred patients, usually depending on the disease that we're looking at, and that's saying what is the most effective dose. So phase 1 usually includes lots of different cancer types. Phase 2 usually says, okay, in phase 1, we saw that it was safe to give, and we think there might be a signal in breast cancer. Or we think biologically or scientifically, there's a reason that breast cancer patients may benefit from this. So in phase 2, we're going to look at breast cancer patients and evaluate the safety again, and then look at if it's effective. Is it working to make their disease better? If we pass through phase 1 and phase 2 successfully, then that would move to phase 3, which is the big newly diagnosed patient population. So phase 1 and 2 are usually in patients who have relapsed or refractory disease, and phase 3 is usually for newly diagnosed patients. And then phase 4 is post-approval. So this is after the drug or the device has gotten FDA approval, and physicians can prescribe it off trial. And we continue to monitor the safety, because even if you add up phase 1 through 3, we're still at like less than 5,000 patients have received this. And so we need to see in a real world, given to real patients outside of a trial, what is happening with the safety. And this is where we're receiving information through the FDA about post-marketing safety and efficacy. So what happens if you want to be involved in a clinical trial? What actually happens? First, there's a screening phase to see if you qualify. And then based on whether you meet those eligibility criteria, which can be quite long and lengthy and take some time to get through, then you're assigned a treatment plan. This could be randomized where you don't have a choice, or it could be assigned based on the disease that you have. Both types of trials exist. And then there's obviously the delivery of that treatment, regular visits and monitoring. And then we collect data, and we send that data to the study team so that we can understand the safety, the efficacy, what's happening with our lab parameters, what the side effects are. We do surveys to see how people tolerate the therapy, and other things that are going on in their life. The safety and protections around clinical trials are pretty intense. The first thing that has to be done and approved is we have to get it approved by something called the Institutional Review Board, which is basically an ethics committee. So an external entity to the trial that doesn't have any kind of skin in the game, I guess you could say, for the trial will review it and alert the team if they think that there's any concerns with any safety or ethical violations. And then there's an informed consent process that I'll talk about, I think, on the next slide. There's ongoing safety monitoring. Most trials either have an internal or an external, what we call data safety monitoring committee. So that is a committee that is separate from the study committee, so they're non-biased, and they look at the data on a regular basis, and they evaluate the ongoing safety to make sure that people are not being unduly harmed from the trial process. And you're able to ask questions at any time during any of this. If you have concerns while you're on trial, it is always your right to be able to ask questions about things that are going on. So what is informed consent? Informed consent is not a piece of paper. It is not a loan agreement. It is not a mortgage agreement. It's a process. Yes, at the end of the day, you do have to sign a piece of paper, but it should be a process between you and your clinical team or the research team that fully explains the purposes of the trial, the risks, and the benefits. They should also discuss with you the alternatives. So if you don't choose to enroll onto that trial, what alternative options do you have? Ultimately, this is always your decision as the patient, whether or not you proceed forward with the trial involvement after you've heard all the pros, cons, risks, and benefits of that trial. So what are the possible benefits? Well, nothing is guaranteed. This is research after all. These are trials. But some of the possible benefits are you may be able to access new treatments that are not available to be prescribed in a usual fashion by physicians because they're not approved yet by the FDA. There is a lot of monitoring, which we know that patients that are treated on clinical trials tend to do better than people that are not treated on clinical trials because we're held to a very high standard of monitoring. A lot of people find that involvement in a clinical trial feels good to them because they're contributing to science, and there is hope that it may help future patients, even if it may not help them. That's a very personal choice and opinion, however. But whenever you talk about benefits, you also have to talk about possible risks. If this is a phase 1 trial and we don't know the side effects of the medication, then they are simply unknown. And we may have signals from animal studies, or we may think based on similar classes what we know is going to happen, but we don't actually know until we do the trial. In some of the cases of trials, the efficacy or how well that drug or that treatment works may be unknown. This is more likely in the phase 1-2 phases of clinical trials, and less likely in phase 3, but still possible. Some trials are randomized, which means a computer system decides what treatment a person gets. We, as physicians, do not get to choose when there is randomization into a trial. So if there is a treatment A and a treatment B, I don't get to say, I want my patient to get treatment A. It goes into a computer system and it is randomized, and then it's whatever treatment is picked is the regimen that we give on the clinical trial. This might be disappointing to some people because they may have an idea of which regimen they would hope for, and sometimes physicians have an idea of what regimen we would hope for. However, once randomization is part of the clinical trial, that is out of our hands. There's always a possible risk of loss of confidentiality when you're involved in a trial because we are collecting health information, protected information. We do our very best to adhere to all confidentiality and HIPAA regulations, but there's always the possibility that that could be lost. And then sometimes, not always, you may have additional time and like clinic visit or hospital visit burden that may be interruptive to your life based on the clinical trial schedule. I think it's important to know when you're thinking about a clinical trial, what choices and what rights you have. First and foremost, participation is always voluntary, and it's voluntary at any time during the process. It's voluntary when you say yes or no at the beginning. If you say yes and you get 5 weeks into it or 5 months into it, and you're like, this is not working for me in my life, you can leave and withdraw at any time. Not only can you leave and withdraw at any time, you can remove your data from the clinical trial if you want to. It is your data, it is your information, and if you don't want it into the database, that is okay, and we can remove it. I think the other thing that I really want people to know is that while I offer clinical trials to many of my patients, I am not offended, my feelings are not hurt, and I am not mad if you decide that you don't want to be on that clinical trial. We are here at Mayo Clinic to provide care to you no matter whether or not you are involved in a clinical trial. We simply want to provide options for you. And then lastly, I think importantly for our AYA population is you can involve others in these decisions. It doesn't have to be your decision alone. You can talk to your spouse, your parents, your significant other, and have them help you make decisions about whether this is a good fit for you in your life. I think about what I would tell my family to ask their physician if they were involved in considering a clinical trial. And I think the first question I would ask my own physician is, why do you think this trial is right for me? Because there's probably a reason that they're offering it to you. And then obviously you want to talk about the risks and benefits. You want to know, if I don't involve myself in this clinical trial, what does my standard of care look like? Importantly, for our young adults and our adolescents, what is the daily impact on life? If this clinical trial is going to interrupt your ability to work and you are the primary breadwinner in your family and that doesn't work for you, then maybe this isn't the right clinical trial for you. Clinical trials usually don't incur extra costs directly, but sometimes there's some indirect costs that come up with extra clinic visits, et cetera. Sometimes some of those costs can be mitigated by programs that are available at treating centers. And that is something that I would encourage people to ask about is, am I going to incur any extra cost? What is covered by insurance, if anything? And if you have to make extra, say, drives to a clinic and you need assistance, what is available at your center? That's going to be variable across different centers and different places of treatment, but oftentimes there are things in place. The next thing I would ask is, what if I start in this and I decide I don't want to do it? What does that look like? And how can I either continue to contribute to the data once I stop the treatment? Or what if I want to remove my data from the data set? How does that work? And everybody should be able to tell you that. That's part of something that we need to do as researchers. And I think importantly, the other thing is, does this affect something that may happen in the future? So if I go on the clinical trial now, does that affect my treatment in the future or limit my options in the future in any way that is predictable at that moment in time? Nothing, none of us have a crystal ball, but I think that's something to think about, is if you do this now, are you sort of limiting the options in the future? And your physician and your treatment team should be able to talk through that with you. Specifically for our adolescents and young adults when thinking about clinical trials, I would really encourage people to really think about what their goals of treatment are, what the goals of being involved in clinical research is, and how that aligns with your personal priorities. So I think I've already alluded to this, but I know many of my AOA patients are very busy in their personal lives. Many of them have children, many of them are in school, many of them have just started new jobs and careers that are very important to them. So if the desire to be involved in a clinical trial adversely affects your personal priorities and the balance flips, then that's what you really have to think about is this the right trial for me at this time? Some of the priorities that I think about and I coach my patients through are, personal benefit. Obviously, if we think this is promising, although not guaranteed, that you may personally benefit from it, then maybe that kind of flips it in one direction versus another. Other people are very invested in just contribution to science and helping future patients. And a lot of people feel like it gives some purpose to a situation that is very challenging. Some of the trade-offs to think about is schedule flexibility. Sometimes if you're treated per standard of care, we may be able to more flexibly move your treatment dates around important events in your life, like weddings, college graduation, birthdays, etc. And sometimes on a trial, it's not that flexible. So that's a conversation that you need to have. And then also, could you get this care in your community? Is there a way for you to receive treatment on a clinical trial, but not have to come to a larger center? Or does all of the care have to be at the larger center, which may be a little bit further from you? So sometimes we can do some decentralized clinical trials where you may be able to go back and forth, but not always. So really understanding where that care occurs. And then importantly for our adolescents and young adults, some of the medications that we give both in standard of care and on clinical trials may have a negative impact on future fertility. And this is something that is very important to most AYAs to understand what that risk is. If we're looking at drugs where we don't have all of the side effects known, that question may be that we don't know. And for other things, we may have a very good understanding of what that means. Because our AYAs are ages 15 to 39 by definition, we want to understand to the best of our ability what are the long-term effects, because we hope that you will go on to live for quite some time after this trial. And so do we know anything about what happens 20, 30 years later? Those are questions that I think should be specific conversations for our patients that are AYAs that are considering clinical trials. So I think the best place to learn more is actually from your oncology team. They're going to be the most up to date about what trials are available at their center. But not every center has every clinical trial open. There is a website, it's a federal website called clinicaltrials.gov that has both a patient-friendly and a provider interface to try to find trials. However, my one caveat with this is it's hard to keep it up to date, and it's hard to understand what slots and what institutions have trials open at any given time. So if you find a trial online, or you find something in a support group or a patient advocacy group and you're interested about it, I would recommend that you bring that information to your care team and ask them directly, because most of the time we have contacts out at other institutions and other communities where we can find that information a little bit faster for you than just looking on the website. It's a little bit clunky, I would say, at the very best. And then here at Mayo Clinic, we do have a contact form if you are interested in understanding what trials we have available for you. This QR code will take you to it. You can also just jot down this website, but it's a little bit long to jot down. And there's a quick contact form that asks you a couple of questions, and then one of our clinical trial navigators will reach out to you to start working with you on the process to understand if we have something that you're looking for or something that you may be eligible for.
All right, so it doesn't look like we have any questions at this time, so I'll go ahead and close out this webinar. I want to thank you for participating. We hope the information was helpful for you. You can click on the link that we're going to be sending through in the chat here. I think we sent it through already to learn about our other offerings and to access additional education, support, and cancer-related resources on our cancer education blog on Mayo Clinic Connect. When this webinar has ended, you will be prompted to take a quick survey. We appreciate your willingness to fill out this survey, as your feedback is helpful to ensure that we are offering educational opportunities that are valuable to you. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.